When I got this proposal to talk about winning in the UN, I was a bit taken aback. It is true that there is a certain competition among member states. You know, we all compete to have a good image, to be good and active members of the international community, the same ways I think you all compete among each other to be good students. So the situation for a UN ambassador is quite comparable to a situation if you are a newcomer at a university, at a college. You know, you come into a big environment where hundreds of others are already there. You try to make yourself a place there. You try to impress your colleagues with your capacities, with your way of negotiating and what have you. But you know, that's, from my point of view, that's fair enough. But I don't see winning, once again, as a way that, you know, I want to see other countries losing, because I think we can only win if at the UN, if we create what I would call a so-called win-win situation, where we all work together, hopefully for a world which is a bit better than the one we are living in. So that's, for my sense, the purpose of talking about winning. Now, but let's face about some facts and figures with the UN. You know, you have, as you know very well, 193 member states. What's maybe less known is that one of the, out of these 193 member states, no less than 105 are small states, which means that they're states of 10 million or less inhabitants. So how are these states then represented? You know, see the General Assembly, every state has, of course, one vote. The Security Council has only 15 members, and the larger other UN organ, the Economic and Social Council, has 54 members. So you can see quite easily not all of these members are represented in all of these organs. But at least one important factor is that at the General Assembly, which is the main organ, every country has one vote. One country, one vote. So what is the role of small states within the General Assembly or within the United Nations as a whole? You see that quote from the former Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, which already said back in the 60s that it's not the big powers, at that time the Soviet Union still did exist, it's not the big powers who need the United Nations, it's rather the small ones, the other ones. So why do we as small countries need the United Nations? I think there are, from my point of view, mainly three reasons why we believe the United Nations is an important institution. First of all, it is a very important, and I would even say probably the unique universal platform for dialogue and discussions. It's really the only place in the world where all countries, small and large, near or far, can come together and discuss issues of common concern. And I'm fully convinced that if we didn't have such an institution, such a place where we come together and talk about commonalities, but also to spell out differences, such an institution would have to be invented. Because if we talk to each other, there's no way of knowing each other's positions and also trying to reconcile them and find some common solutions. The second point is the standard setting. The United Nations sets standards in various forms, being resolutions, which are, of course, only politically binding, but also international treaties, which are of a worldwide application. And I think it is also very important that the United Nations, as a legitimate forum, is an organ institution which sets certain standards, which are then applicably, universally applied through all nations. And the advantage of that United Nations doing that is that we all have a say. As I said before, at the General Assembly, there is the principle of one country, one vote. And that guarantees that the small states, they have a say, they can participate in the decision making, and that the rule of the power of the law is then pitched against the law of the power. Because, you know, if you don't have an institution where we all commonly try to agree on some standards and some norms, the alternative is basically that the big powers are imposing their law on the small powers. And I think that's something we would like to avoid, especially as a small state. We really much depend on the United Nations as a protective institution which guarantees us the right to participate and the right to set certain standards. And the third and also very important factor is that the UN is a promoter and coordinator for operational activities, meaning especially, well, not only in peace and security, because it sends UN peacekeeping operations to countries in conflict or where there's civil strife or other violent forms of conflict, but also, even more importantly so, in the field of poverty reduction, health, education, development in general. You know, we only also speak about the victims. For instance, in Syria, you know, there have been 60,000, 80,000 people have been killed there in that conflict. But you know, in the media, you rarely ever heard or hear or read about the daily thousands of people who are killed out of poverty, out of malnutrition, out of lack of health, out of lack of sanitation, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, every minute, for instance, you know, as we speak, 13 kids are dying out of hunger or malnutrition. So, in this 10-minute lecture I have given so far, 130 kids have already died. And thanks to the United Nations, they have been able to reduce child mortality by 70%. So you see, you know, what an important operational role the United Nations is playing. And since most of the small states are developing states, you can see also the importance which United Nations has for these states in particular who need our support, who need our assistance, because quite often they are living in conditions which are extremely harsh and suffering from civil unrest. Now, just to show you a bit, you know, what can small states do at the United Nations and what not. I think if you look a bit from my own experience, what you can see, what small states can achieve is that they are quite often very dedicated, they are innovative, they're flexible, they are, I would put that maybe in quotation marks, unsuspicious, and of course we are numerous, you know, we are in the numerical superiority. And just to show you a few examples, there are several initiatives which are important worldwide which have been undertaken by small states. Did you, for instance, know that the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which governs the rules on the high seas, and basically these cover 70% of the surface of our planet, have been initiated by a small state called Malta? Have you also known, for instance, that the International Criminal Court, which is one of the, I think, newest foundations of the United Nations, has been created by initiative by Trinidad and Tobago? And as a last example, to cite my own country, we have an institution which is called the Human Rights Council, which is a permanent institution in Geneva, caring and looking after the respect and the application of international human rights. This has been a Swiss initiative. Just to show you as examples, you know, that small states are really, to a certain extent, the drivers of United Nations progress and reform, much more so than bigger states. The advantage is that we have quite often small administrations, so the red tape part in our government, in our administration, is much shorter and much smaller than in big administrations. Take an example, you know, my government, you know, our civil service abroad, our diplomats, we have 360 diplomats all over the world. The US State Department counts 70,000 diplomats all over the world. So we have a small but very effective international civil service. I don't say that the United States Department is ineffective, but I just say that they work in with much bigger resources, but bigger resources mean also bigger administration, longer decision-making channels, et cetera, et cetera. So this makes it all much more complicated. What is also interesting, talking about the unsuspicious part, you know, that the United Nations has a tradition that certain important political posts, like the Secretary General of the United Nations or the President of the General Assembly, usually comes from a small country. From a small country because even the big powers, they think, well, it is better to have a Secretary General from not a powerful one, because Therefore, it doesn't meddle with the big powers, and it's maybe better controllable. On the other hand, I think it's also good for the small countries to be represented by one of their peers. So if you look at the last Secretary Generals, I would say apart from one, which is Boutros Boutros-Ghali, which is Egyptian, which is not really qualifies as a small country, and maybe to the actual one, Ban Ki-moon, who is a middle-sized country like Korea, all the others came from smaller countries. You had Norway, you had Tigre Ali from Norway, you had Dag Hammarskjöld from Sweden, you had Kurt Waldheim from Austria, to make an example. You had Pérez de Cuellar from Peru. So you just see many Secretary Generals have been selected from small countries, and therefore there also you can see the role of small countries in shaping the United Nations. And then the numerous part is maybe also an interesting one. Of course, small states usually tend to be looked away, or let's say are looked over to a certain extent at the United Nations, unless there is one important event taking place, meaning elections. When the Security Council or other important organs are being elected, there you have once again the principle of one voice and one country. And even small countries like Samoa or the Maldives or Switzerland or Liechtenstein or whoever has a voice, you know. And if you need a two-thirds majority in the General Assembly, these voices count. So you can see there the numbers, they matter. The difficulties of these small countries is, of course, you can see that they are limited in capacities. Most of my colleagues, especially those coming from developing countries, they have really problems in matching up with the huge agenda which the United Nations presents. And the other problem is, of course, that we are not united. There is this forum of small states, which counts about 100 members. If we 100 members would be united all in the same time and all on the same issues, we could theoretically be a very powerful force. The problem is, however, that these small states are divided in subgroups. You have developing countries, you have developed countries, you have countries from the West, countries from the East. So these countries, small as they are in themselves quite divided, which of course limits their capacity of joint action. And the last point, of course, being small does also mean you are prone to pressure. Of course, the big ones then try to bully you, and I will show you an example then afterwards how this materialized in concrete cases. So therefore, of course, being small has also some clear disadvantages. So I want to show you one concrete example, you know, how we as a small state tried to improve the working of the United Nations. And I use this as the so-called Small Five initiative to make the Security Council more transparent, accountable, and effective. So you know the Security Council is, I would say, the most powerful organ of the United Nations. It counts 50 members, 5 permanent ones, among those the United States. And it's the only institution which can impose binding decisions, impose binding sanctions, even declare war in a situation. Now the problem is, of course, that what the Security Council decides does concern all of us. We are all, as members, obliged to implement these Council decisions. But since there are only 15, we don't have a say. We just have to do what the Council asks to do us. That is one point. The other point is, of course, also, it's more delicate, that the Council is very intransparent in its work. I would say the transparency of a UN Council is as much as high as maybe the transparency of a cardinal's conclave to elect a pope. So you can see a bit how transparent the Security Council is working. And what we were trying to do, the Small Five, and I come to that who the Small Five are, was precisely to open up the transparency and accountability of the Security Council, because we are the ones electing the Council. We are the ones who have to apply Council decisions, but we have no idea what the Council is doing. So you can see just briefly, I want to give you an overview what the Council is doing. The Council, as you know, is the primary organ to ensure international peace and security. And therefore, he has a very major role in ensuring that all over the world peace and security prevails. The members of the Council in 2013 are here. You have the 5 permanent ones on the left side and the actual non-permanent ones on the right. These are elected for 2 years. And you can see there are some small countries in there, like Luxembourg, for instance, or Rwanda or Togo. But what is also interesting from my point of view is that over 70 members of the United Nations have never been serving in the Security Council at all. So it's at least, you know, almost 1/3 of the whole membership never has been elected in the Security Council. So what have we been doing? Because as my colleague of New Zealand said, you know, most of us are basically pressing our noses against the walls, the window walls of the Security Council, knowing what the Council is doing. So we created in 2006 the so-called Small Five, and you see these Small Five here on the screen. And the goal was to make the Council more accountable, more transparent, and more open to the rest of the membership. Meaning, for instance, that the working plan, the agenda of the Security Council should be published to the member states. At least we know what they're discussing. We know what they're deliberating. So we proposed a number of ideas back in 2006 to have a draft resolution. And one of these proposals, which was of course politically very delicate, is to ask for a voluntary renunciation of the right to veto in cases of genocide and other serious violations of human rights or international humanitarian law. As you know, the 5 permanent members of the Council, they have individually the veto, and they have been using it. The last example we have been confronted with is Syria. In the case of Syria, Russia has blocked 3 times a resolution by the veto. And we all know what dramatic effects this veto has. You know, the Assad regime continues killing people by the hundreds and the thousands. I'm absolutely sure and certain that if the Security Council would have presented a unified stance vis-à-vis the Assad regime, we wouldn't be in the situation as we are today. So the suffering of thousands of people in Syria is due to a good part to the situation of the veto in the Security Council. And we were proposing that at least voluntarily the members of the Security Council would renounce to that. But this was only one element out of many to make the Council more open and more transparent. So what has happened then in the meantime? The Council, we actually didn't at 2006 bring this proposal to a vote, because the Council then came to the Small Five and said, listen guys, we are ready to talk. We are ready to open up, improve our working methods. And there were really some improvements were made. They, for the first time, for instance, drafted some terms of reference, how they would interact with the wider membership, how they would open up, how they would be more accountable. So there were really some practical progress was being made. But unfortunately, it was not something which was really implemented. The Council proposed some improvements and put some ideas on paper in a document, but this document was never really fully put to the test or really implemented in full. So we decided about 2 years ago, in April of 2011, to present new proposals from the Small Five, which were essentially going the same direction as the ones before, because they have not been implemented in the first place. Now, in long discussions, we tried to convince the Council to this time, a second time around, to be more open. But this time, unfortunately, the Council was reacting much more stronger and much more negatively than before. So we decided to present a draft resolution to the General Assembly, which we then tabled, presented officially to a vote. But we had then to realize that with various machinations and some kind of doubtful legal arguments and procedural steps, the Council had then convinced a good part of the majority not to support a resolution. And therefore, we, in May 2012, withdrew the resolution in order to avoid that there would be some procedural and legalistic quagmire. I think if we would have went through with the vote on the resolution, we would have left with some confusion, with some angry delegations, and it wouldn't have served the purpose. And there you can really see to what extent then the major powers in the Security Council are very jealous in preserving their prerogatives, because they believe essentially that we, as the whole membership, do not have a say on how the Security Council should interact with the rest, how it should open up, how it should be transparent. They say quite clearly, working methods is really the only and sole prerogative of the permanent members of the Security Council as a whole. Sorry, my clip was just leaving me here. So maybe also the Russian colleague who has now made that, since I was talking about the P5, some Russian spies. I just wanted to show you this example, to explain to you, how far small states, we can go, what we can achieve at the General Assembly. Let's say working at a certain time maybe against major powers, but also to show you quite clearly where the limits are. At a certain point, there's really a breaking point happening, and we see that we can just push the wall against these big powers so much, but not as much as we would like to. Now, well, this is not, fortunately, the end of the story, because we are now learned the lessons from our, let's say, defeat, if you might call it that way. So we have regrouped now. We are not a small five anymore, but we are now a group of around 20 countries of small and medium size, and we will push again. So for us, this kind of struggle, this kind of strive for more accountability, for more openness is not over. It's just beginning right now. And those among the Security Council who have believed that now this story is over and done with, they are soundly mistaken. So just to conclude, maybe, what is it to win, and how can you, if you wouldn't want to use this word, win at the United Nations? My own experience is that it takes basically 5 elements as a small state. You need to have first good ideas. Then you need personal investment and hard work. And then I will call it the 3 C's. You need to be courageous. You really have to have certain courage. You need to be convincing, and you need to be credible. Then, of course, that's something which is true, I think, for any kind of international or even kind of multilateral framework. Have your principles, but still be flexible and ready to compromise. And last not least, I think that's something which is obvious. Excellent relations and good networking play a role, because as a small state especially, you need to create alliances, you need to create majorities. You can only do that if you really have a good network and you really work hard and you're really someone who is convincing.